Welcome everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Ollie Pinson-Roxburgh, I'm co-founder at Bulletproof, and in today's webinar, 5 things a hacker doesn't want you to know, we intend to provide you with some insights into how hackers operate, as well as to provide you some practical steps that you can take to secure yourselves against those threats. The data all comes from our security report we released recently, as well as some additional research we've been doing since we released the report. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about that today. We wanted to give everyone that registered for the webinar the opportunity to ask us any questions, and so today I've got 2 experts with me, Nicky and Kieran, who are going to be answering some of the questions. Kieran, our head of pen testing, as well as Nicky, who's heading up our compliance team. So we'll get to those questions a little bit later on. So the inspiration for this webinar really came from us looking at the data that we present in the security report each year. And we really find that a good proportion of what hackers are doing is hidden from many businesses, either because they don't have the expertise to gather the information, but then also research it, but also just because a lot of what hackers do day to day isn't really exposed to many businesses. So the idea of the report is really to expose that data, and also this presentation really to expose that data to you, help you to get into the mindset of the attackers and how they operate. But also to give you some data to help support that and give you some advice as well at the same time. The data that we've got is both from the security report, but we've also added some additional research in here. So you're going to get a bit more information if you have read the report. If you haven't already, please go download the report because, like I say, it's very useful, I'm sure, for you to help identify where those threats are coming from. More specifically in this webinar, I'll be discussing what motivates the attackers and how do they think. I'm going to be talking about how attackers find their targets and how easy it is to find a target on the internet. We'll discuss, does cloud make businesses risk-free, as well as we'll be looking at how difficult it is to deal with the latest threats. And also, how do hackers see our security tools, and do they know our tools better than we do? And we'll look at some of their tools and what sort of features they have, as well as we're going to be talking about how you can keep on top of threats. And then towards the end, I'll share my top tips for cybersecurity in 2020 and introduce a few other bits and pieces from Bulletproof. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with Kieran and Nicky answering your questions. And yeah, the webinar will be available to you at the very end as a recording that you can watch back. So if you've missed anything, you'll be able to go back afterwards and watch it all again. For me, one of the most interesting bits of data this year that we have comes from our Honeypot Systems. And it shows that if you put a system on the internet, within 32 milliseconds, it's going to be detected, which is literally the same amount of time it takes you to blink. So what it really shows us is that it's critical to ensure that security is in by design, because if we, by mistake, put a system on the internet, very quickly that machine is going to be detected, and if it has a vulnerability, there's a good chance that somebody will be trying to exploit that vulnerability in that similar time frame, or certainly very quickly after they've detected it. So with that being said, the first thing that we really need to be doing as an organization is to understand what their exposure is, because that's what an attacker does. They'll be starting by trying to find what else is out there on the internet that they can exploit. So we need to think like a hacker. So in this next section, we'll look at motivations and a few other things to help you to get into the mindset of the hacker. And each of these adversaries is really motivated by a different goal and objective, ranging from causing disruption all the way through to fame and notoriety. And in the vast majority of situations, however, money is the big motivator, and is often not only seen in organized crime campaigns, but also seen in nation state campaigns, where in order to fund their operations, they're hacking organizations to either steal cryptocurrencies, to of course do cryptocurrency mining, but also to use ransomware as a way in which to fund themselves. And so if you're an organization that has access to credit card information or sensitive data, or you're more likely to pay a ransom for the return of your service to your customers than another organization, because maybe you have the funding to be able to do that, then you're a high value target, which really means you need to understand what level of security you need to defend against these adversaries. And if you really can understand that, then it also helps you to identify what campaigns they might be running as organized crime groups or even nation state actors, in order to ensure that you've got the right level of security and protection in place. So once you've had to think about the types of hackers that might be targeting you through their motivations, the next thing is to understand how they might attack you. And the first stage of any attack is reconnaissance. The attackers are trying to find what vulnerabilities might exist in the environments they try to exploit, whether that's an automated approach, where they're just scanning the whole internet, trying to find systems that are vulnerable. Typically in this approach, they'll be trying to find the same vulnerability, and they rinse and repeat the same attack over and over again. But if it's a more targeted attacker, they're more likely to spend a good proportion of their time just performing reconnaissance activities to find what they might be able to exploit. And when it's very targeted attacks, they're more likely to be able to target a specific organization and spend a significant amount of time trying to target that organization, in which case they might even try to find new vulnerabilities rather than reuse old vulnerabilities. So they're often thinking, how mature is this organization? Is it worth my while to try and exploit this system? In the case of course, more organized crime groups, because they might be able to move on to the next one and exploit that one in a couple of minutes, rather than taking days to exploit those systems. And then, of course, they will probably be asking themselves the question, how quickly will I be detected? Because the attack might change. If they suspect that you've got a fairly mature environment, they might choose not to hack you at all. Or if they did hack you, they might take the approach of using ransomware as opposed to using a cryptocurrency miner, because a cryptocurrency miner, you need to be as stealthy and stay in the environment as long as possible. One of the questions organizations often have is, where are the attacks coming from? And yes, there's a very good detection mechanism, because of course, if you're a company that only works within certain regions, if you see attacks coming from different locations, or even legitimate activity coming from different regions that you don't ordinarily operate in or have business in, then it's an easy way to detect malicious activity. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to really tell whether the traffic is really coming from that location or not, because it could be that the attacker has exploited a system in Russia, for example, and is using that to pivot onto another system elsewhere and attack another environment. In our stats, this is data from the report. It shows 55% of the traffic came from China, but there's no real way to validate whether that is really traffic that originated from China, or whether it was an attacker somewhere sitting in America and happens to be sending their traffic through China. So although the data is very interesting and useful, as far as protection goes and protecting you from attackers, you will have to assume that attacks are coming from all over the world, and it's more about proactively monitoring suspicious activity and blocking and dealing with it as quickly as you can. So a real quick recap, we've looked at what motivates the attackers so we can better understand how they might target us, and depending on what type of business we are, we might find a different attacker targets us that has different motivations, either opportunistic or targeted. We've looked at how they first start their attack, performing some form of reconnaissance, so we can start to think about how we might look to detect their attacks. But we need to understand how those attackers operate. So there's two typical types of attacker, the first being an opportunistic attacker, which are really looking for those very easy targets, often attempting things like brute force attacks against cloud services. One clear example of that recently is a ransomware as a service tool called Snatch, which really targets, during the campaigns, they're targeting Azure servers as their kind of initial entry, using things like brute force. And then once they're in, they then go and deploy ransomware and then try and hold the organization to ransom with those servers. The other approach is to be much more targeted. These types of attackers tend to be more skilled. They're not just using existing vulnerabilities. They may be finding their own vulnerabilities. They'll have a very specific goal, and they might be building their own custom tools for that goal and that campaign that they may be running at that time. Examples of this, of course, are targeting bigger businesses and using techniques like whale phishing, and certainly doing things like drive-by attacks, where they may target a particular system they know that the organization they're targeting uses and try and exploit that first in order to gain access to the system. They may even try attending site to gain either information or gain access to systems. Some recent examples of this are things like SpaceX, where although the attackers were using ransomware to make their money and hold their organization to ransom, that particular group is very focused on targeting bigger organizations as opposed to going after lots of small organizations. So now we've had to think about what motivates an attacker, how they might approach an attack. The next step is to look at how they actually exploit those vulnerabilities and how they find unpatched systems to exploit. Before we get into the specifics, however, of how an attacker might find a vulnerable system, let's first have a quick look at some of our stats. In our penetration testing data, we found that over 50% of the flaws that we find represent a significant risk to the businesses. We're also finding that applications, as they become more and more easier to build and much quicker to produce, that organizations are putting more and more systems into the cloud, they're increasing their attack surface area. And so, of course, the attackers are now targeting external systems going back out to the perimeter, whereas before, of course, we saw attackers targeting more and more internal systems. We're now seeing them again targeting systems like Azure, systems running in Azure, and of course applications on the internet. And if we drill into those flaws, we find that 50% of those flaws are due to out-of-date or unpatched systems, which is very similar to last year, followed by access control issues, weak cryptography, and poor passwords. And of course, the attackers know this as well, which is why they're scanning the internet looking for unpatched systems that they can exploit. Of course, I've already shown you a couple of ways in which attackers might target systems, basically scanning the internet looking for those vulnerable systems, but there are plenty of other ways to find vulnerable assets. And one that I thought I'd show you because I think it's really interesting is that you can actually use Google to find vulnerable systems. Now, this tool that I'm showing you here is actually on the internet, it's easily accessible, and it's really used for researchers and organizations to keep on top of the latest threats to the systems they might be using. In this case, it's a WordPress theme that has a cross-site scripting vulnerability, but I want to just bring your attention to the second line in the text at the bottom there, which is something called a dork. And this is called a Google dork, which is basically to provide you with the search terms, if you're a researcher, to find all the systems through Google on the internet that might be vulnerable to this particular issue. And so I've run that vulnerability. So I've basically taken that text, I've put it straight into Google here in text, and it says fruitful theme by fruitful code powered by WordPress. And if we put that into Google, of course, it then shows me that there are 28,000 results, and it returned that in just a few seconds. There's 28,000 sites I could potentially try to exploit. And just to prove that this was a real issue, I actually went to one of the sites to check that the fruitful theme was actually installed, and sure enough, on that site it was. And it also showed the site that I used, ExploitDB, to find those vulnerabilities, and it brought that search results back. So it's not always the tools you expect. It's not these underground tools that only the hackers know about that you can find these vulnerabilities. Sometimes it's using tools that we all use day to day, like Google, to find their targets. And here's another tool that maybe is not the type of tool you'd expect attackers to be using because it's, again, a commercial tool built for security researchers to help see what's out there on the internet, because the internet is continually being catalogued in order to really understand what is exposed. And like I say, for both research and help improve the security of systems out there for businesses as well. So you can, of course, as a business, pay for this subscription in order to see what has been indexed for your own network and your own systems exposed to the internet. In this case, the tool allows you to create some common searches, so top voted searches here with 11,717 is the webcams. So of course, a lot of attackers are out there trying to hack webcams for a number of different reasons. We can also see there are some featured categories here where you can look up things like industrial control systems, as well as some recently shared stuff over there where people are sharing information like Ryuk searches, which is a pretty well-known ransomware, a piece of ransomware. But of course, from an attacker's point of view, what these tools help them to identify is what is the most commonly used systems on the internet. They will then research those systems in order to find those targets and then, of course, start hacking them. And of course, there will be tools that the hackers will be building themselves that are very similar to these to identify those systems on the internet. What I decided to do as well is to pull out some of my own research. So in this case, I've pulled out some RDP servers in order for us to sort of see what it might look like to do a search like an attacker. In this case, we can see that there are a number of screenshots here of all manner of people's servers on the internet. The interesting thing, of course, is that with RDP, it does already provide some interesting information and exposes some interesting information straight away, because it will show you the last logged in users in some cases. So you can see some of the screenshots, you can see some of the usernames there that can be stolen straight away and used as part of the attack. Okay, so following that theme, now I know that there's some RDP servers on the internet. I thought I'd go and look at our own data. So in this case, I was looking up our Honeypot servers again. So there we have these servers on the internet that are exposing common services in order for us to identify if they're being, if anybody's trying to exploit these servers, but also to give us an idea of what types of attacks are happening at any one time against these types of systems, and is there something new that we might be able to spot that we can help improve our customer security by monitoring. And in this case, over a 6-week period of time, against RDP servers, which we've just found can be easily identified on the internet, there were only over 2,301,000 total attacks from over 1,800 bad actors. And if we look at the campaigns here, they're brute forcing these systems, but essentially what they're doing is some of them are doing those very quickly, so over a short period of time, which may suggest they're looking for a very specific set of credentials that they can use against a server, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Or it's over a longer period of time, which they're being maybe a bit more persistent than they would ordinarily do. So it may be just a very opportunistic attack where they're trying more credentials over a longer period of time in the hopes that at some stage they might become successful. And so looking at those credentials, what we can see, of course, is the attackers are trying the default credentials, as you'd expect. So again, it really reinforces how important it is for organizations not to use default accounts for any system users that have special privileges. So making sure that we're not using the defaults like administrator, admin, backup, any of these that have these kind of higher levels of permissions, really we should change those. And if we do have these sorts of accounts, again, the password should be very secure and strong, and they should be kept in a secure fashion. Of course, any sort of administrator activity should really require second factor authentication and should use another account name as other than the defaults in order to stop these sorts of issues like brute force attacks. But we can also see in the data, which is really interesting, is that there are some very specific ones in here, like this support support _3889450, which either is something that's come from a default account used by some vendor, or it could be that it's on a data breach database somewhere and the attackers are just adding that to their list of credentials they use. The other interesting thing here, as I mentioned in the previous slides, one of the things you can find out from RDP is in actual fact what user accounts people might have logged in the past with. Now, in an automated attack, you're less likely to do that because, of course, it involves some form of integration that can scrape the information from those services. But in this case, we actually saw that some of the attacks, they were using the name of the workstation that we'd exposed to the internet. This HR workstation is actually our workstation system that exposed on the internet, and they were actually using that to attempt to log in, which is quite interesting in itself. Over the total period of time, we saw 53,967 usernames. And we also saw the attackers targeting things like financial servers, i.e. usernames were POS, which is point of sale, and also Micros, which are a vendor that provides point of sale systems. So again, it sort of ties in with what we said about the motivation of the attacker. Often they want to make money. A quick way to do that is to steal credit card data and information that can get them to the point where they can get access to that data that they want to be able to monetize. So as we can see, attackers are continually scanning the internet, looking for vulnerable systems, and of course attempting to brute force accounts of people that are either reusing their passwords and are using weak passwords for their credentials. The key thing at the moment is that organizations are not fixing things quick enough. And so a new statistic that the security industry is sort of tracking is the mean time to remediation, which is essentially where once an organization finds out they have a vulnerability, how quickly can they patch that system, so test it and get it into production or deploy it as quickly as they can. So there's a bit of a race to fix, really. But of course, in order to do that, you really need to understand the risk and the potential impact. Some attacks are weaponized pretty much immediately because as soon as the vulnerability is released, there's some proof of concept code that allows you to both test to see if the vulnerability exists on your systems so that you can identify, is it something that would immediately be exploited, so I should patch it as a priority or not. But also from an attacker's point of view, because they can see that there's some proof of concept code that will show them how to exploit that vulnerability, they can go and build a tool that can scan the internet for the vulnerability, test to see if the vulnerability exists, and then in some cases automatically exploit that vulnerability, gaining access to those servers and systems. And so because of this, in order to reduce risk of hosting these sorts of services in-house, many organizations are moving to the cloud in order to try and move some of that responsibility onto the cloud providers. But it's not risk-free. So in order to really understand that, that it's not necessarily risk-free and you can't really let your guard down in the cloud, we pulled out our stats. We're obviously continually observing what's going on in environments that are running cloud services, such as things like Office 365. So we just picked one of those. And in a month's period of time, we saw over 4,000 malicious login attempts. So not only are you likely to see attackers attempting to exploit on-premises systems, just moving to the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to stop attempting to brute force these systems. And also, the cloud providers tend to operate a shared responsibility model, which means that many organizations haven't really thought about that too much, about how do I protect myself, because they're assuming it's already secure out the box, which it isn't always. You do have to implement some configuration, and also depending on your license that you have will depend on what features you might have. So it's equally as important in the cloud to be monitoring these services to see if anybody's attempting to exploit your systems. So as we can see, the attackers are preying on the weak, really. They are going after our people as they're the path of least resistance in many cases, using things like brute force attacks as well as credential stuffing and spray attacks, which is where the attackers are getting access to these data breaches where credentials are leaked, and then they're using those to attack cloud services and other internet-facing systems with those credentials to see if they can gain access. And if that doesn't work, of course, they're then going down the route of using phishing. So anyone can be a target, and it's often, that it doesn't really need the interaction of the user for their accounts to be compromised. So training is critical to reducing the risk, and implementing, monitoring of these attempts to log into systems to try and block out anybody trying to access your environment that you don't trust, as well as using things like two-factor authentication for your users to of course, ensure that your accounts can't be compromised where that they're not going to use the strong passwords, or it's very difficult for them to use strong passwords. So really making it easy for users to not make mistakes. And the other thing, of course, as we've seen, hackers are automating a lot of stuff. They're using tools to their advantage, which makes it very difficult for us to keep up with them. And again, this is demonstrated with the Honeypot data. We obviously talked about this stat at the very beginning of the presentation, but putting a system on the internet, you can clearly see automation in use, because a system's found within 32 milliseconds. Over a 2-day and 24-hour period, we saw 260 known bad actors and 1,964 unique IP addresses and 12,757 requests received over that same period of time, which is about 3 requests per minute. So there's no way a single human's doing that. It's of course tools that you're using, and they're just finding ways to continually gather information about your systems that are out there and your attack surface area. And of course, hackers know your security tools, and they know how to get around those tools often, and they're always looking for new ways to get around the tools that you have in place. And it's really sort of demonstrating that hacking is not always hard to do. Anything online can really be a target for an attacker. It's their kind of playground, really. Many of the tools are sort of free. Obviously, the people are the path of least resistance, as we've seen, and also the hackers are continually evolving their tools. And so I'm going to show you a few of their tools, or their features they have in their tools, in the next couple of slides. So what we've done here is we've basically taken data from the most recent malware samples out there to identify what are the key features that the attackers are building into their own tools. And we can certainly see, of course, there are features within their tools to disable our security tools, so disable Windows security. And so you can already see that they're understanding the tools that they're in use and being used, and then of course they're finding their ways around it. We can also see that most of the systems have command and control, so it's a communication back to the attackers, so they can send data to and from, or upload new features to their malware once they've got it deployed in an environment. We can see a good proportion of the new malware is coming out as a service, and they're capturing user and system information, as well as harvesting credentials from systems and extracting files from browser caches and cookies, as well as they're implementing still things like keyloggers to capture your passwords and any information you're entering in. And then, of course, also looking at things like file creation and being able to extract files, as well as enumerate other systems. So they'll often try to get a piece of software in, and then they'll try and enumerate other systems and servers around it to try and hack another machine in the network, and then continue to pivot off of those further and further into the network. And you can also see they're doing things like audio and video capture as well on a lot of their tools. So hopefully that's been useful, but what I want to do in the next section is really to talk about what you can do about it, and what are the sorts of things you need to be implementing, and the sorts of controls you need in place. And so here are my top tips. So Ollie's top tips for 2020. First is patch your systems. We see this far too often in our penetration testing data. As you can see, over 50% of those criticals being down to unpatched systems. We often see organizations that are not getting rid of their defaults. So default credentials, you shouldn't be using things like administrator. You should give your admins specific administrator accounts, both to ensure that you reduce the chance of compromise through brute forcing, but equally also so that you can monitor user activity, and you can make sure your admins are doing the right things on your systems and servers, or tracking what they're doing on your systems and servers. You of course want to monitor your systems, your networks, because of course as soon as you get that sign of initial reconnaissance, then you've got the opportunity to start doing something about it, or at least be aware of the attack and start planning what you're going to do about it as soon as that happens. You want to make sure you're hardening your systems, following best practices like CIS and CIS benchmarks. Often it's quite hard to do, and you don't necessarily want to lock down absolutely everything, but taking one of those standards to baseline your security off of, even if you don't deploy the whole baseline or implement all the features, at least get the basics in place, helps to improve the overall security of your systems. Make sure you're testing your incident response plan. We've seen too many forensics investigations where people either haven't detected the breach at all, or they didn't really know what they should do in the event of a breach, and it's essentially compounded the issue, and they've had a lot bigger problems just because they didn't know how to handle it, i.e. they didn't capture our information, or they deleted servers or took servers down because they panicked rather than testing their plan. So certainly plan for the worst. Make sure you're training your teams, because of course they need to know both what does good look like, but also teaching them how attackers are targeting systems, and of course training them on what's the right approach and best practice. So going down the route of sort of doing security training, as well as doing other forms of training for your techies, maybe more specific incident response training. And for those of you who don't really know where to get started, we've actually created a package for you just for the webinar, which includes all the top things we think you should be doing, like the vulnerability scanning, of course, monitoring your systems for your critical assets, as well as getting Cyber Essentials done. So Cyber Essentials, of course, assesses you're following best practices around security, and of course getting some training in there as well. So we've got this package available to people who've watched the webinar for your most critical systems and users. And so now we're going to get into the Q&A session. So we're going to take those questions that people ask in advance of the webinar, and we're going to go through those questions with Nicky and Kieran. Okay, we've got our first question here, which is, how safe is it to store your data on OneDrive, and is it GDPR compliant? I think that one's for you, Nicky.
Yeah, OneDrive is the Microsoft's cloud-based file storage that comes with the Office 365 suite. How safe is it? Largely depends on how it's been set up, what kind of Office 365 environment you've got. A key one is really making sure you've got a strong password on that account, and if you can, enable two-factor verification, which you can now do with OneDrive, to improve your security. So it's relatively secure, and I mean, nothing is 100% secure. And with the business version, you can also encrypt your documents at rest, which is particularly relevant for GDPR, particularly if you're storing personal data. Is it compliant with GDPR? Well, this question gets asked a lot with any cloud-based service because very often cloud services aren't hosted in the EU. Now, Microsoft host their environments both in the US and across the EU and the rest of the world. So you can have your OneDrive hosted in the EU. However, it doesn't really matter if it is hosted in the US because Microsoft has is signed up to something called Privacy Shield, which is an agreement between the EU and the US government to provide a specific level of security that meets the EU's requirements for GDPR. So it's perfectly fine to have it in the US, and it would be considered to be GDPR compliant, although that's a term you can't really specifically say what that means because there isn't such a thing. But you'd be fine from a GDPR point of view if you used OneDrive.
Excellent, thanks for that. The next one is one for Kieran, I think. What ratio of successful cyber attacks stem from social engineering versus the other typical external entry points?
So it's difficult to say. We don't necessarily find all of the successful attacks, so it's very hard to say how many what the root cause was for any specific attack. In terms of the ratio, it's basically impossible to say. We do know that social engineering is successful. We know from our own data that when we perform social engineering attacks, they tend to be very successful. The people sitting in seats generally are still the weak points in lots of different organizations. As to whether or not that's the most common way of gaining access, it's basically impossible to say. We see a lot of the high-profile attacks that have happened over the last year or so. Many of them were just simply misconfigured environments where there was some low-hanging fruit that was exploited by people and they were able to exfiltrate data. So yeah, it doesn't really answer the question about what ratio, but social engineering attacks are very dangerous, but so are other kinds of attacks.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that we made a point of is that the in our previous sort of discussions was certainly that as part of the report itself is that you only need one person to fail, and then it's kind of a pivot point into the network, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like we always kind of preach like security in depth, making sure that if you do have a failure, that you have a way of logging it, and making sure that if one part of the organization is compromised, that hopefully that doesn't result in a full domain compromise and the rest of the environment can not quite carry on, but at least the access to particular data, sensitive information is limited to any kind of compromise.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, we've got another GDPR question here. I'm interested in learning more about GDPR compliance. Where do I start? One for you, Nicky.
GDPR is a bit of a monster, and it is difficult if you're in an organisation and you've been tasked with getting yourselves up to some level of compliance to the regulation, and it is very difficult as well if you just go and pick up a copy of the actual regulation and try and work out what you need to do, because a lot of it is in legal speak. So a really good starting point for any organisation, I think, is to get some training, and because that way you can pull out the salient points from the regulation that are relevant to your organisation. You can do that through, classroom-based training. You can do that through specific tailor-made training for your organisation, which is something that Bulletproof can offer. Or you might even do awareness training through online videos, which again is something that Bulletproof can offer. And then, once you've got that understanding, you'll probably start to realise that there's quite a lot of holes in what you're doing in your existing organisation. And one of the things we suggest organisations do in terms of compliance is to perhaps perform a gap analysis so that you can actually see where the gaps are, and then you can start an implementation project, whether you do that yourselves internally or you do that with a consultant-led. Again, something we can help with. It depends largely on your resource and what you've got available.
Excellent. And I guess more on the specifics, I suppose the first part is to understand where your data sits and all that sort of
Yeah,
stuff as well?
absolutely. I mean, one of the first things we do with clients when we go on site is a data flow mapping exercise, which will actually go through the different processes that you have in your organisation, those that handle personal data, so that you can actually get a picture of where the data comes in, where it goes, who's got access to it, what kind of security you've got applied to it, where it leaves the organisation, etc. And that really is the starting point, so you can get a picture of what you're dealing with.
Excellent. Okay, we've got another one here for Kieran, I think. I don't know if I need a pen test or a vulnerability scan. What's the difference?
Okay, so the difference is a vulnerability scan is largely tool driven. So we put the scope of work into the tool, like, so for an example, let's say it's an external infrastructure test, so it's a scan of an organization's perimeter. The tool will go away and it will look for any services that are visible, and it will enumerate those to see if there's any known vulnerabilities associated with whatever is visible to the internet. The tools we use are pretty good, but they are tools, so there's a couple blind spots. They don't always understand what, if they see a result, they might not necessarily be able to kind of infer what that might mean for the environment as a whole. So, for example, a penetration test will generally start off with a vulnerability scan, and then they'll take the information. There's a person in a seat who will start off with the vulnerability scan. They'll take that information and they'll be able to use that to infer certain things about the environment. They might be able to simply just by looking at the results, get a better understanding of what's probably happening behind the scenes. And we often will have situations whereby I can't prove that there's a vulnerability here, but there's information here that is going to be useful to you because I've been able to kind of join the dots. There is some advantages of vulnerability scans, like they're much cheaper to do, so you can do them more often. It gives a good kind of visibility of any emerging threats. So if your scan is in January and then a new vulnerability comes out in the end of January, your February scan will pick that up. They're also good at tracking whether there's been any changes to the perimeter of the environment. But in general, like, that's where the penetration test starts. It starts with the tool, and then you have a person involved who can then kind of draw some additional conclusions and also kind of move on from there. They can interpret the results, they can think outside the box.
To validate the findings.
Yeah, validate the findings, exactly, yeah. Because you will sometimes get false positives with vulnerability scans, and having a person in a chair kind of helps to kind of remove that as an issue.
Cool. And then I guess from a compliance point of view, there is a mandate often anyway, right, Nicky?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly things like PCI DSS, which is the payment card industry data security standard, has requirements to do regular vulnerability scans. Even within the GDPR, there are areas putting in place technical and organisational measures to secure your data, and it does mention sort of testing and that kind of thing. And ISO 27000 as well. 27001 also discusses the use of vulnerability scanning and penetration testing for testing your environment and making sure that you're secure and you remain secure.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we'll ask whenever a client comes to us. We'll ask, like, what's the driver for your pen test, for your vulnerability scan? If the driver is compliance, whatever it is you're working towards, whether it's PCI or whatever, will be pretty clear in whether you need vulnerability scan or pen testing or both.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you. We had a couple of last minute questions come in here, so I'll pick these ones up because they're slightly more general security. Where is the best place to find data, if any, on cybersecurity events in healthcare organisations? Well, the best place really to start is NHS Digital. It sort of provides digital services for the NHS and social care, and so they're a good place to start. From a security standpoint, they provide CareCert intelligence, which is essentially an intelligence feed that's specifically written for the NHS. So there's a lot of specific malware might affect the NHS due to the systems they tend to run, and or if there's any sort of machines or devices that they're using that have vulnerabilities, that gets provided through as information for the NHS IT teams to be able to follow that advice and remediate those issues. General best practice still applies in the NHS. Of course, they've got vast networks and very specific devices often in their environments, but of course, because of the size of their networks, they typically have issues with things like patching and other things. So if there's a sort of general piece of malware out there that's spreading through unpatched systems, of course, those are the sorts of typical events you'll see affecting systems with that sort of size of infrastructure. So in reality, what I'm kind of saying, I guess, is there's a few specific sources of information like NHS Digital, but in general, they'll have the same security issues as many other organisations. This one's a good question. With the onset of user behaviour analysis and system behaviour analysis to identify trends, are there any new technologies or novel ways to secure systems? For me, at the moment, machine learning still isn't really where it needs to be. It needs a lot of work. So supervised machine learning is still imperative at the moment, and if we, especially if you don't want to be hit with lots of noise and false positives, so people are still required for the machine learning that I've seen in the market at the moment. However, there are some interesting stuff coming in the not too distant future, which I think will be very useful, and it's more focused on, rather than looking at your internal users and how they work day to day, and to profile those internal users. And there's another approach to that is to flip it on its head really and try to profile the hackers. Now, if you think about it, they're probably more predictable than our internal users, because they're following very similar campaigns as we've talked about in this presentation. Of course, they take similar approaches where they start reconnaissance and they'll do some sort of information gathering. They're looking for the same or similar vulnerabilities in lots of different systems that they're trying to exploit. They've got common things that they like to drop, like their tools, and they like to drop their tools into certain locations because those locations might run with different privileges or give them access to other services that can run with higher privileges. There's lots of what the attacker does, which is arguably more or easier to profile than, say, some of our users and how they operate. So I would say that looking really to the future, and like I say, the not too distant future, it will be more about profiling how the attackers operate and just looking to spot more of the malicious activity versus trying to identify what normal looks like for our users. Thanks for those questions, everyone. We really appreciate it. It helps us to keep these sessions interactive. If there are any questions that we didn't answer, we'll certainly get back to you shortly on those, and we will send those out via email. But just to quickly summarize and wrap everything up, a couple of points I wanted to bring back to the forefront is hackers will pretty much use whatever tools that they have at their disposal, whether they're building them themselves or they're using commercial grade solutions, and also using just things we use every day like Google, to help them to identify their new targets, and also for things like research. Their tools are feature rich. As you saw, they're looking at the kind of malware itself. They're adding lots of features to their products, both to steal information and to find new ways to make money. They're also looking for ways around security tools. Of course, we saw some of the features being able to disable the security technologies in place. They're obviously testing a lot of their own malware on security tools in order to make sure that they can get around those systems. And they're obviously looking to innovate where they can. They, of course, use automation to cover ground, which makes them very noisy. But of course, that then means you have to weed through the noise, and that makes it hard for you to be able to identify what is just noise on the internet and what you should really care about. So it's quite hard to keep up with them when they use these automated tools. So it's really enabling your teams, making sure that you've got the right resources to help you to detect those attacks, but also not waste time investigating the wrong things. And then there's new techniques coming out all the time, and they're really using cutting edge technologies as well. More recently, we've seen new types of executable files being used by attackers, like .sfx files, which are at the moment not particularly well supported from a EV or malware detection capability. So there's often the attackers are finding out these new solutions in order to get around the security tools just because they don't have support for them just yet. So keeping an eye on and getting intelligence data, but helping to identify identify what intelligence is important to you is quite critical. And again, unfortunately, that either relies on resources or to find a partner that can help you to detect that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. If you've submitted any questions which weren't answered, we'll get back to you directly on those. Don't forget you download the security report from our website, both for last year's and this year's. If you want to take us up on the Security Essentials special offer, then just send us over an email at info@bulletproof.co.uk. And if you have any other questions, or you want to feedback anything on the presentation, or if you want to give us any suggestions on more content for future webinars, then please contact us on the details provided on the slide. We look forward to hearing more from you.